join today's session. We're really grateful for you joining us. Just to lay out what we're doing here today. I mean, I think with the emergence of COVID, we've seen a lot of challenges to the way that business has occurred and the way that trade takes place. And essentially, what we're, sorry, I'm just going to put everyone on mute because we're getting a bit of sound there. Yeah, we're just thinking hard about how in this series, how the world and particularly East Africa is adjusting to the reality of the COVID environment. It does mean some short-term problems like we're seeing at the borders at the moment, but also long-term changes in the way that supply chains are basically organized. We had a very good initial chat a few weeks ago. I want to thank again the speakers. And, one of the buzz lines that came out of that was, let's take the opportunity here in East Africa to make the most of what comes out of this. And I think it is really interesting seeing the way that the manufacturing sector in many of our countries is stepping up and now producing a lot of key medical materials that are really important in the fight against COVID. But today, so anyway, we're having, let me just finish that off, if you don't mind. Today, we're going to have a look at particularly at standards, but we're going to have a series of these different discussions on Twitter and on social media. We really encourage everyone out there to engage and to take part. So, welcome everyone. And today we're looking at standards and, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic is a global crisis, but it's already affecting food and the agricultural sector. The availability of safe food supplies are obviously fundamental to human health and productivity, national well-being and poverty reduction, because many of our economies are so reliant on agriculture. There will obviously be serious threats due to the current crisis and also issues of lockdowns and other restrictions. So it's important that standards play an important role in really driving forward what we call safe trade. So today we're particularly looking at the role of standards in really the whole crisis and how they play a role in food supply chains, but also medical supply chains. So with that, really, I wanted just to lay out some ground rules, if I could, for this discussion. First of all, if you join the discussion, could you please keep yourself on mute? If you'd like to make a point, please use the chat function, okay? And that's the one with the kind of speech bubble in the menu that comes up when you put your cursor across. All the participants are also available. So if you want to see who's there, just touch the symbol with the many, with the people logo. So what I'd like to do is for everyone, if they could, just to keep themselves on mute. And we'll be kicking off now and looking to finish around 4 o'clock. Please send your questions in because we want to make sure that this is not just speeches, but very much we respond to the questions that people put out there on social media. I'm just going to ask my colleague Nelson Karanja, who's our communications director here at TradeMark, just to mention how you can get your message across. Nelson, would you please just explain to everyone connected how they should pose their questions? Obviously, there's a chat, but if you want to do that on social media. Over to you, Nelson.
Thank you, Frank, and welcome everyone who's joining us in this session. As Frank has mentioned, we are also leveraging our social media platforms where this particular discussion is ongoing. We currently have it being streamed live on our Twitter platform. If you have any particular question, please mention the participant who has asked that question. Frank will be going through the list of panelists, so make sure your question is against the panelist's name and then pose it. So you can either pose it, as Frank has mentioned, on this chat, on the chat function, or you can post it on our Twitter platform where we'll be able to pick it up. We will aim to answer as many of those questions as Frank will be moderating the session to send those questions to the specific panelist. So Frank, that's how we'll be playing the questions, yeah.
Okay, thanks as always. Really appreciate Nelson. So if you've got questions, can you send them either via the chat on the side or via Twitter, and we look forward to engagement. So I guess without further ado, let me introduce the panel. First of all, I'd like to introduce, now I suggest panelists that when you speak, pop your camera on like I am, and then everyone can also see you, if you're willing to do that. So first of all, let me introduce Eric Keek. Eric is the Capacity Building Director at the International Standards Organization, the ISO, Central Secretariat in Geneva. He previously worked as a Senior Trade Facilitation Specialist at the World Bank Group, and has also been a Director for Capacity Building at the World Customs Organization. So welcome, Eric. Great to have you here today. I'd like to then introduce Martha Byanyima. And Martha is the Chief of Party at the Land of Lakes Venture 37. And she's in charge of the Trade, Agriculture, Safely and Efficiently in East Africa project, which is known as TRACE. And she works through TRACE with the private sector and governments throughout the region. And prior to that, she worked heading up the SPS unit at COMESA. So welcome, Martha. Jacqueline, I'd like to introduce Jacqueline McKindy. She's the development manager. She's the CEO of TAHA, the Tanzania Horticultural Association. She currently also chairs the Agricultural Council of Tanzania and has extensive experience in the sector, and has also been on the board of TPSF, the Tanzania Private Sector Foundation. Okay, I'd like to also introduce Melvin Spry. Melvin heads up the Standards and Trade Development Facility, SDTF Secretariat at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Melvin's been working in the sector for a very long time, has great experience internationally, and he's also worked as a counselor in the Commodities and Agriculture Division at WTO. So welcome, Melvin. I'd like to also introduce Hermogene Singamana, and he is the Secretary General of the African Organization for Standardization, ARSO, which is an intergovernmental organization formed by the AU to really look at standards, and also with UNECA, so it's AU or UNECA. So welcome, Hermogene. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Apollo Awar, who's the current chairman of the FPEAK board. Apollo is the founding director of Fruitful Farms since its inception in 2017, and has a huge amount of experience in the food and agriculture field. Actually, not quite finally. And standing in for Minister Emilia Chambade of Uganda, we've got Emmanuel Mufahanga, who's the Commissioner for Trade in the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Cooperatives. And I think he's still trying to join us. So welcome, everyone. And I'll give you a round of applause on my own here, but welcome. And I think we're really lucky to have such a distinguished panel today. Okay, well, without further ado, because we started a little late, I'm going to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Alain Esimwe. Alain is our Chief Technical Officer, CTO, at TradeMark East Africa, in charge of really all of our technical work, including oversight on standards. So, Alain, you have the floor, and I will beam up the presentation for you.
Everyone, karibuni sana. It's so good to have you here to really discuss some of these issues that we are thinking about as an organization and that the region is grappling with. I'm going to ask my colleague Andrew to just give a very brief oversight of the legal and technical aspects. We're not going to delve into the techniques of standards. We're really focusing on standards and trade, but we thought we would set the scene with just the background on, the overview, the legal framework. So Andrew, over to you, just 1 minute or two to provide the legal framework. Then I'll talk about the impacts and the opportunities for trade for our region.
Thank you very much. As you may know, standards are the language. A foreign buyer who knows the standard to which a product has been produced will always have confidence in it. Standards, therefore, will help to reduce disputes when it comes to international marketing of goods, especially across the borders. These standards are also used by governments to promote social goals, but the government agencies may then lay these standards and require that they are applied. In most cases, governments apply these standards to promote social goals, that is, health and to ensure safety of the population and to conserve the environment. Such regulations cover both the product characteristics, but also the materials and produced in producing them. Compliance with these standards set by government is obligatory. However, while standards promote trade, they can also be used to become obstacles to trade, and if they differ from country to country. If every country has their own standards, then it becomes a problem to the private sector. In this regard, therefore, international rules governing the use of standards require that these standards are going to be harmonized and they should not be used as a barrier to trade. The idea here should be to facilitate trade and not to use them as an additional constraint. The Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement governs these standards. On the other hand, countries may, in addition, require that the compliance of imported food and agricultural products is observed in accordance with their national regulations. Now, these are called Sps Standards. It's about addressing the risk in food safety, animal health, and plant health. Under COVID, this becomes very important because it's fear that the goods being traded, especially food and agriculture, may carry with them the risk as they are traded. So they have to be addressed. As TradeMark East Africa, our work has been therefore in the line of standards and SPS measures to assist countries in the region develop what we call the quality infrastructure in the region that supports the application of these standards in a manner that will not cause obstacles to trade. And therefore, in this region, TradeMark East Africa is running a number of programs. And these programs support the ESC, and they support the different countries in ensuring that they have the relevant infrastructure in place to support the development, the adoption, or application of the various standards. At the same time, we support competent authorities in the region to ensure that they check, they inspect, and they approve these standards before the product go for export. In the context of this, COVID has brought about a disruption, and it's at this point that I want to stop and allow Alain to speak about the disruption that COVID has brought. It's no longer business as usual since this emergence of COVID. And therefore, back to you, Alain.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There is not a single part of our lives that hasn't been touched. And as I sit here in my little study space, working and thinking, there's so much impact that has been had, on all aspects of our lives, and especially on standards. We are seeing a lot of governments stopping the movement of people. We are seeing a lot of goods. The supply of foods and essential goods has disrupted. Actually, what we are seeing is that there are goods on the line. A lot of work for the stats bureaus. And I think this is a big one for the region. We are anticipating increased demand of good hygiene standards and health protocols to facilitate exports to high-value markets. This is akin to the green footprint that we already know. If you're exporting some products to Europe or elsewhere, they will want to know whether these products certify and comply to certain standards. Are we going to see the same applying to standards? So we are seeing a lot happening. But then there are also opportunities. And I think one of the opportunities that we are seeing is that we are seeing a lot of repurposing of factories, because the demand for PPE, medicines, and all has been so high. We are seeing a lot of repurposing. But these products must be fit for standards. They must be usable. They must be of a quality that is not going to cause harm and also not abet the spread of COVID. We're seeing a lot of innovation in production of ventilators, testing kits, potentially vaccines. Standards are going to be critical in ensuring the technologies used in mitigation are safe. We are seeing increased demand of foods in the region, of regional produce in our traditional markets, in high-value markets in the UK, in France, in the EU. It's so heartwarming to see that there's a lot of demand for our produce. Unfortunately, given us certain challenges, the price of cargo, the lack of airlines and cargo space to fly out our products, we are not able to meet all the demand, but the demand is there. But the standards remain. We are also seeing opportunities for new markets under the Continental Free Trade Area and in the Middle East. It's so heartwarming to see the demand for animal produce in the Middle East coming from Africa. We are seeing a lot of demand for fresh foods and for produce. So there's a lot of opportunities. We are also seeing a great opportunity for the convergence of regional standards and protocols and the mutual recognition of accredited tests. We should not be in a space where Uganda is doing its own thing, Kenya is doing its own thing, Rwanda, Tanzania. We want to see how we can actually use this opportunity to converge our standards to the global standards, but also to ensure that accredited tests are recognized. And finally, there's an opportunity for safe disposal of hazardous waste. We are already learning from other countries that people are using testing, are sort of utilizing already used products if they are not well disposed of. So there's a lot of opportunity, but the challenge is also big. And Frank, I hand over to you to ask our panelists, how can we as TradeMark and how can the region better respond to this dynamic? Thank you.
Very much, Alain. That was great. And folks, I hope you could see the presentation. And I've just attached it in the chat so that if you want to have a look at it, that kind of touches on what Andrew and Alain were saying there. Okay, well, look, thanks so much. I think that set the scene quite well for some of the issues that we want to discuss. So first of all, I'd like to call up Melvin Spray, obviously who's the head of the SDTDF at the WTO. And Melvin, do you want to just put yourself on camera if you would, sir? Several countries have issued restrictions on imported goods in the current context of COVID-19. Do you think these countries are justified to issue such restrictions under the WTO system? Over to you to answer that one.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, and a good afternoon to all of you from Geneva. I hope the connection is good. Frank, as you already said in your introduction, this pandemic is primarily, of course, a health crisis, but it also represents a big challenge to society, to the global economy and to world trade. But I think that over the last week, one message has been quite consistent, whether it's come from trade ministers around the world, from G20 leaders, and that is that it's really important to keep trade and international markets open. Now, a first complicating factor, I think, here is that some WTO members have introduced export prohibitions and restrictions. And generally speaking, the WTO rules prohibit export bans, but the WTO allows members to apply them temporarily to prevent or relieve, for instance, critical shortages of food or other essential products. And for example, we have seen reports also in the media of export restrictions of medicine supplies and equipment over the last weeks. Now, second, and then coming to your question, we also see that supply chains are suffering from import bans and restrictions. And is this possible under the WTO rules? There are two agreements relevant here, and Andrew in his introduction already mentioned them. So very short, the TBT agreement, which generally allows prohibitions and restrictions on goods if there is a legitimate objective, for instance, national security requirements, human health, or consumer protection. The TBT agreement encourages WTO members to use international standards for their national regulations. So technical regulations in accordance with these standards issued by international standardizing bodies, such as ISO, also on the panel, are presumed and not to create unnecessary obstacles to trade. Second, you have the SPS agreement, which specifically deals with food safety, with animal and plant health. And this agreement encourages WTO members to base SPS-related trade restrictions on international standards as well. In this case, developed by Codex for food safety, the OIE for animal health and zoonosis, and the IPPC for plant health. Now, in the absence of an international standard, then SPS measures should be based on a risk assessment. So there should be a scientific justification for the restriction, essentially. Now, you can imagine that in some cases it takes time before you have actually sufficient scientific evidence available to assess the risk. So under the SPS agreement, members have the right to adopt what we call so-called provisional measures. So as more scientific evidence emerges and a risk assessment can be carried out, then the provisional measure imposed must be reviewed. So to give you a very concrete example here, the first SPS-related reaction to COVID-19 among several WTO members was to restrict trade in live animals. Now, as more information on ways of transmission became available, and the principal route of COVID-19 is now understood to be person-to-person contact, we can see that some of these restrictions are now being lifted. Now, a proliferation of restrictive measures in trade and agricultural products and other goods and not only endangers the functioning of supply chains and also food security, but it also simply undermines the ability of companies, and specifically I would say small and medium enterprises, to continue to export their products. And this is becoming a real issue also in East Africa. So the question really is then what can be done? So very short. First, countries should avoid putting in place unnecessary obstacles to trade. So any COVID-19 trade measures should be targeted, should be proportionate, should be transparent, and should be temporary. So for example, countries should review and where possible remove some of the hastily adopted COVID-19 measures in the beginning to really limit their impact on food availability and supply chains. Second, countries should really speed up their trade facilitation efforts. In particular, I should say also for what I would call perishable or SPS sensitive products, to reduce costs, but also to limit situations of food loss. And it's actually quite interesting to see that rather than restrictive measures, several WTO members have recently notified what we call trade facilitating measures to the WTO. For instance, enabling electronic certification and other IT-based flexibilities in controls and document checks. Thirdly, this crisis, I think, accelerates, calls for further diversification, both in terms of products and markets, which in turn will have implications on the level of standards compliance and SPS and TBT compliance. And so firms should really explore domestic market base, and there is scope for more regional integration, to expand regional trade, and to really speed up also implementation of the African continental free trade area. And finally, I think very important point that I would like to make is that countries should really use the guidance and the recommendations that are issued by the standard setting organization. So far, there has been no recommendation that has been issued to actually restrict trade. The FAO and the WHO have jointly issued what they call interim COVID-19 guidance for food business operators and competent authorities. And well, food business operators, for instance, are essentially recommended to continue applying existing good hygiene, good manufacturing practices, but to also take additional measures, for instance, related to social distancing or wearing of face masks. Competent authorities, for instance, are recommended to really focus their inspections on high-risk goods, for instance. But above all, I think the guidance from the FAO and the WHO really shows that and illustrates that COVID-19 is a respiratory illness, and the primary transmission route is really person-to-person contact. And so it is highly unlikely that people can contract COVID-19 from food or from food packaging. So with that, back to you, over to you, Frank.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Melvin. Some really good points there. And I think it's good to hear that you feel that you really recommend that any restrictions put on should be temporary. And some good insights there. Thanks very much, Melvin. Well, I'm already got about, I think, 10 questions coming in thick and fast from the audience. So many thanks, and keep them coming. The team's just processing them, and then we'll upload them to me and I'll put them out to our panelists. I just wanted to check, do we have Emmanuel Mufahanga from the Ministry of Trade in Uganda on the line?
Hi, Frank. He's still having a challenge. If we could proceed to the next question, and we'll try and get him on.
Okay. Well, Emmanuel, keep on trying. We'd love to have the voice of the Ugandan government in this debate this afternoon. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome Jacqueline Makindi, who's the CEO of the Tanzania Horticultural Association. Jacqueline, I think you're connected now, so welcome. I wanted to ask you the question, really, as a major exporter of fruits and vegetables, what impact has the COVID-19 crisis had on supply chains and export processes for you and your members in Tanzania, but also across the region? And are there any interventions that Sunripe has adopted to promote safe trade? Jacqueline, if you could answer that question and put your camera on at the same time. Over to you, madam. You have the
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank. I think I'm online now. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes.
Yep, can hear you fine. Did you hear the question I asked?
Yes, I did.
Okay, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Mkindi, and I'm the CEO of Taha Group, and we are responsible for horticulture development and horticulture transformation in Tanzania. So we are running a non-for-profit, but also we are also running commercial companies, and one of the companies is responsible for logistics support services to the industry. So horticulture being one of the key agriculture subsector in Tanzania, and also being an export-oriented sector, is also hugely impacted, just like the general agriculture sector, the way it is impacted by the COVID-19. As we all know that our sources, the sources of our markets impacted, and yeah, so when we talk of the horticulture per se, there is a closure, for example, of the flower market or the flower auctions. Our high-end markets in Tanzania are also hugely affected, like the tourism, the tourist hotels. About 500 hotels, more than 500 hotels in Tanzania, mainland and Zanzibar are already closed as a result of the pandemic. Schools, colleges, universities, which also offers a source of our market, are also closed. So you will see that, farmers or SMEs who used to, sell produce or product to these kind of markets are no longer able to do so because of what is happening. So yes, we are also impacted, but there are some of the initiatives that as an organization we have already implemented just to make sure that we are still servicing a readily available market, especially domestic, regional, but also international market. And as a result of the pandemic, you all know that most of the airlines suspended their operations to our countries. And for us, for example, we used to rely on KLM, which is a passenger flight, to ferry our produce to our EU markets. And so the cancellation of KLM to Tanzania meant that we were not able to actually send our flowers and our fruits and vegetables to EU. And so our only option remained exporting via Kenya. And that option was not also working very good for us because of competition in Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. So we resorted into the idea of bringing in a freighter and as an organization, and we really worked very closely with the government agencies, and we are able to sign a deal with Ethiopian Airline. And now at least produce that going to EU markets are still going through this airline. But so far we have not really been able to sell, to send our produce to Middle East market, where also the demand is huge. And we are receiving calls every day asking us if we could actually supply our fruits and vegetables to such markets, but we are not able to supply because of, you know, a lack of transport means. So that is one of how our industry is impacted. But again, talking of employment, horticulture is also one of the sectors that employs quite a number of women and youth. And some of the companies are already reducing the number of employees going to the farms because of the situation. So we are losing employment here. And investors are still in a dilemma on whether to maintain the labor force that they have or to actually, you know, reduce to by 60, or some are talking of even reducing employment by 80%. So this is actually, if the situation is not going to actually stabilize in the near future, we also see a huge negative implication on our young people, and especially women who actually used to rely on, who used to service these companies. Talking about inputs, of course, agriculture is also impacted heavily in Tanzania, because you talk of fertilizer, for example, we rely on importation of fertilizer. About 90% of what we consume here comes from external market. So with the border closure and lockdown of some countries, and some factories in the international market closing down, is also affecting our accessibility to quality inputs such as fertilizers. But also in livestock, we are talking of having no parent stock and vaccines and whatnot. So accessibility to agricultural inputs and technology is one of the areas that is also negatively impacted. And I think efforts should be done by the regional authorities to see how best we can address that area. So what are the major initiatives that we have done as the private sector? Of course, one, we've tried to address the logistic segment, but we are also on top of the matter negotiating with the government on how to continue creating enabling environment to attract more cargo operations to other routes like the Middle East and other areas. So this is a discussion ongoing. But we are also discussing with the government on the tax or tax relief issues and stimulus packages to some of these investors in the horticultural industry, but also in the government. Our current strategy as the private sector, given the skyrocketing demand of food in the international market, is to implement the fill the shelf strategy, because we are also seeing that as an opportunity. Food is now hugely demanded by the market, so we are seriously working out modalities to boost productivity despite the current situation. So we are busy building clusters of key value chains that we have identified and prioritized as a result of surveys that are ongoing, following the calls from the market. So fill the shelf strategy is one of the initiatives that we are implementing in collaboration with our partners. Yeah, so that is what is happening in Tanzania. And another area that I think is very critical is coming up with a revolving credit.
Jackie, could I ask you just to wind up if that's okay? Oh, just one more minute.
One more minute. Of course, there are still gaps that we are trying to address, and this is the area of revolving credit for air freight, which I think is something that the regional partner should take up as an harmonized initiative, just to make sure that we are sustaining cargo operation across the region rather than making it or leaving it being the operation for like one country. So cargo operation should be looked at as a regional initiative rather than being one country initiative. So let me end it here, and probably I will respond to questions if asked.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. I think what we're going to try to do is run through the presentations, and then I'll come back with questions, if that's all right. So, Jackie, thanks, and really interesting what you were saying there about the industry and how you're trying to adjust. And this fill the shelf strategy I thought was very interesting. So we'll come back to you later, Jackie, if you could stay on the line. Okay, I know now, I think we've got Emmanuel Mufahanga, who's the Commissioner for Trade and in the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Cooperatives in the government of Uganda. Welcome, Emmanuel. Good to have you on the line, sir. And it's good to hear the voice of government in this debate. I mean, obviously, as the COVID-19 spreads around the globe, there's a fears of a global recession, basically coming on. Some fear, obviously, that food supplies may start running short, particularly if the supply chains are disrupted. And we heard that, I think, from Jackie a bit just now. Others fear that, obviously, agricultural production could be disrupted by containment measures that have been put in place that reduce the ability of workers to bring in, harvest or handle crops. So from the government of Uganda's perspective, what kind of measures should governments in East Africa take to ensure that the supply of agricultural goods is not negatively impacted? So Emmanuel, could you please, you have the floor to answer that question. Over to you, sir. Yep, Emmanuel, are you there? Okay, I think we're having Emmanuel's having some problems.
Yeah, I think Frankie may have dropped out of the call, so we will try and reconnect again.
All right. Well, obviously, we'll hope to hear from the voice of government. Maybe I'll pass it then over to Hermogene. Hermogene, welcome. Hermogene is the Secretary General of the Africa Regional Standards Organization, ARSO, and welcome, Hermogene. Tell us, maybe from the perspective of a Pan-African institution, how can African countries create a much more coordinated approach to ensure that essential goods are not only traded safely and quickly across borders, but they also meet, very importantly, the necessary safety parameters? So over to you, Hermogene, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, for the invitation actually to participate to this panel. When you look at the COVID-19 lessons that we learned at ARSO level, is two. Many countries have now come and called asking for which standard can we use for hand sanitizer, for mask, and to some extent also toward the ventilators. And when you look at it, it's taught us that the standards are crucial, and now not even the standard bureaus, even at the level of the ministry, even of the level of the research institution and industry, they are looking at those standards. That was crucial. And when you look at the bigger picture, on the African continent. The tools are there because looking at the policy level, we have the Abuja Treaty that's actually a set requirement establishing the regional economical communities. In its Article 49, it requests the adoption of common standards. In the presentation that introduced this meeting, the harmonization of standard was very, very crucial. And starting in 1991, you see that was on the policy level. And when you look at the current now Continental Free Trade Area, under the TBT Annex 6, the SPS Annex 7, it's again requesting to develop and promote adoption of international standards and also promote adoption of a standard developed by African Organization for Standardization and the AFSEC in the area of electrotechnical. Then the policy are there, but what are really the challenges that we have seen so far? That's probably a COVID will change. It was the low appreciation of standards. But with this COVID, I see more now people looking at, yes, we are all African, we should trade to one another, but what I want to trade with you, I should accept that it has a quality level that my population requires, that my industry requires. And that's also linked now to what should we do, as you asked, Frank. I put it into four key issues that's on the African continent we should do post-COVID or during this crisis. One, post-COVID, we should look at how do we influence the standardization work at all levels, influence the standardization work at international, at continental, meaning Africa, at regional economical community, and participate as industry at the national level, because we have seen many of the industry that we have on African continent. When you look at the way they participate in the committees of standard development, usually they don't participate actively because their mother industry are outside Africa. But this COVID have taught us now you cannot even import those products from outside. You should look at the solution that's with the raw material that you have on place. By participating, influencing in the standard work, we need to do four things. Participate, yes, international level, but look at the needs of harmonizing standard on unique product for Africa, looking at what we require as Africa. And the other issue is to look at the SMEs. How can we bring the SMEs into the value chain? At African level, we have what we call maturity model. How can you help the SME reach a level of quality at a lower level, moving forward from bronze level to gold level? That is another crucial point to do. And lastly, on the standard influencing is membership, because you cannot influence the standard setting in ISO, in ARSO, when you are not a member. And this actually has been a point of our head of state in many resolutions from African Union level, requesting African Union member countries to acquire membership in the African institution in charge of quality. Second point is harmonization of conformity assessment. When you talk harmonization of conformity assessment, if we don't have good conformity assessment, we cannot have the mutual recognition that was put in the discussion during the presentation. Mutual recognition of our test results will be there if we have capacity in testing. If we are using the same standard, because usually that has been the problem. A country will ask you, which standard are you using? That I should accept which test method that you are using. Third is harmonization or approximation of technical regulation and regulatory framework. We should ask our question, when we develop the technical regulation, we know these technical regulation are based on the standards that have been developed. Which method do we use in referencing these standards within the technical regulation? We should really think about this. The other area that's on technical regulation is to see, do we sit together and agree and look at what is important for us to have an equivalence in these different technical regulation, which is a complex area, being technical regulation in the area of agriculture. It's not the same in the area of construction as you can see. Lastly, the main other issue is collaboration. This COVID-19 have also taught us that whatever we're always thinking, actually we challenge also the issue of between SPS and TBT, that we want to show they are completely separate. We found out that actually all of us should sit together. Regulatory bodies, standard bodies, a government, research institution, all of us need to sit together and start rethinking, start seeing how we can collaborate in the development of standard and in also regulatory matters. I thank you, Frank.
Okay, thanks, Hermogene. Some really good points there. I much appreciate. And the chat's going crazy. Lots of really good points for everybody. And Hermogene will come back with some questions later. I think I've even seen a job offer on the chat, so definitely something you should tune into, I think. Okay, well, thanks, Hermogene. Let me pass it over now to Martha Byanyima, who's the Chief of Party of the Trace Project at Land O'Lakes. And Martha, can you recommend any quick and effective policy and regulatory changes that could facilitate safe cross-border trade and obviously assure the exports of agricultural products from the EAC under the current circumstances? So over to you to answer that question, Martha. You have the floor. Yep. Martha, you there? Martha?
Yeah, thank you. Listening to Melvin and Hermogene, it's very clear that we already have so many commitments out there that countries have made globally and even at continental level on how to deal with transboundary diseases and problems such as COVID-19 in a manner that protects health and also doesn't disrupt trade. But what has been the challenge? The challenge is that while the tools are there and while the instruments are there, the application of these tools varies across countries and across businesses. And what I'm learning from COVID-19 is not new. It's just that countries need to rethink on these commitments and see how they apply these tools and instruments in the way that they protect supply chains, but also don't disrupt trade. That has always been the problem, creating a balance in the way you do things, in the way you make policy decisions and regulations, that you impact on protection, you achieve protection, but you also don't disrupt trade. So COVID-19 impact has been so overwhelming that countries are coming up with rafts of measures, some good, some disruptive, some well thought out, some scientific, and some not scientific. So we need to go back to the basics and think about the relevant standards that we can implement quickly and bring about a careful balance between protection and trade so that we are able to continue our trade, we are able to exchange goods, we are able to protect our food supply chains, while at the same time, trade facilitation is not undermined. In terms of businesses and countries, what I realize over time is that with varied implementation of these standards that already exist, like Hermogene and Melvin said, trust is undermined. And you find that countries, because they do not trust, therefore they put all sorts of precautionary measures to protect their own people, the health of their people, and also their food systems. So we need, as quickly as possible, to put in place mechanisms that can enhance trust. And these mechanisms can be in the short term, but they also can deal with the long-term improvements in the trade systems within the ESC and between the ESC and other countries. So to answer your question, I thought about a few actions that I think should be prioritized. Again, the biggest problem when COVID-19 comes with such overwhelming impact, countries have not thought carefully and prioritized their actions. There's been a lot of investment in human-to-human to stop the human-to-human transmission, which is rightly justified. But I think we also need to look more at how to protect food supply chains and the people that work in those supply chains, people working in the businesses and people working in the inspection systems that provide assurance that indeed our supply chains are safe. So I think as a first action, we need to critically examine the supply chains behind borders and prioritize our actions. Strengthen our SPS systems in a way that they are proactive, we are able to deal with the problem, while at the same time facilitating trade to continue happening. And this just should be basic systems that countries can have and that can be trusted by their trade partners. But we also need to invest in greater transparency and collaboration in countries and within the country. The One Health approach that the WHO talked about for a long time, where the animal health, plant health, and food safety need to work together, has never been any more important. What COVID-19 tells us now is that it's even more important in a country for the different agencies to work together and strengthen their systems and also work across countries and improve their collaboration. We need to look not only what's happening behind borders, but what's happening at the borders. For a long time, we've been talking about delegating authority at the borders, having minimum disruption, and having actions that are facilitating trade and reducing overall transaction costs. And the tools are there that can allow us to approach these problems in a scientific way, challenges in a scientific way, and in a low-cost manner, so that the overall impact on trade is not as of high impact as it is today. So we need greater collaboration at the borders, and if possible, delegating authority so that we have minimum presence at the border and that a lot of the verification is done behind the border, leaving goods, expediting goods across borders. I think what's very important now is also to realize that in addition to the international food safety standards that companies have been implementing and which standards are accepted globally, we need additional preventive strategies to preventive against COVID-19 particularly. And these must be built into the safety protocols for the businesses and for the inspection systems. At the borders, we talked about interagency collaboration, but they must have protocols that speak not just to trade across borders, but also talk about preventive strategies for COVID-19. And I've heard a lot about, and mapping supply chains is going to be very critical. The observation that countries have made that truck drivers are high risk factor needs to be taken into consideration. There are other high risk factors that haven't been identified. But if you map out the supply chain, it should be possible to identify the factors that are increasing risk and deal with them in a very proactive manner.
Sorry to ask, could you wind up, please?
In winding up, I want to say that we must, to the extent possible, use technology to connect our systems across countries, to connect the services and the people who provide those services. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Martha. Some great points there. I really liked some of the things you were saying there. Really good. Sorry to cut you short, but we're running a bit behind time. I'm going to extend this session by about 10 or 15 minutes to make sure we can take questions. But I just want to hear from the rest of our panelists. And I'm going to hand it over now to Eric Kick, who is the Capacity Building Director at the International Standards Organization. And Eric, I mean, what could you tell us a bit about what the role of ISO standards are in really promoting this concept of safe trade? And, you know, how can our countries here in East Africa benefit from the work and those standards being developed by the ISO? Over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you for this this conference, and greetings from Geneva. Just to jump into the question, I think just something to notice that I wanted to share with the group. As an immediate response to the COVID-19 pandemic, ISO, as well as its members, the national standards bodies, have made critical international standards on personal protective equipment as well as medical devices freely available online for access. We have also included standards as part of this related to business continuity management systems as well as risk management. We believe these standards relating to both essential goods, medical devices and products, as well as to the business continuity and risk are really important both for public sector organizations and of course private businesses as well. As a matter of fact, we will shortly start with a project with the International Trade Center to focus on developing country SMEs and specifically the implementation of these specific standards that I've mentioned. From a conformity assessment perspective, ISO standards are used by laboratories in testing to ensure the quality and the safety of products like sanitizers and gloves, but they're also used in laboratories that undertake medical testing for infectious diseases. I can also mention that the ISO conformity assessment standards support testing, certification, and inspection of goods that are traded globally across borders. Since March, we've been working very closely with other relevant international organizations, such as the International Accreditation Forum and the International Laboratory Association Corporation, on alternative measures for conducting these assessments. These assessments, of course, are very important to keep the cross-border movement of goods going on. So we've looked at things like remote assessments, and conformity assessment bodies has also worked very closely with us to cooperate to identify false and fraudulent certificates that are used in cross-border trade. Just going back to your question, Frank, around why it's important, especially now, to look at the use of international standards. I can mention that in global trade, the two main users of international standards, on the one hand, are governments, and then, of course, the marketplace, producers, buyers, and users. As mentioned by Melvin as well as Hermogene, for governments, the international standards facilitate the adoption of good regulatory practices. And of course, the TBT agreement requires that technical regulations that are imposed by governments be based on the relevant international standards. Regulations that are not based on these international standards, of course, increase the cost of doing business. As a matter of fact, a few weeks ago, the Peterson Institute for International Economics released a trade policy note where they actually urged governments to adopt international standards to ensure that the quality and safety of imported health products are guaranteed. From a private sector perspective, a marketplace perspective, of course, as we all know, with increasing complexity of global value chains long before the pandemic, and of course the recent emphasis on safety, international standards serve both to enhance trust as well as competitiveness. We also anticipate on an ISO side an increased demand in the use of our standards related to conformity assessment. As you would be aware, these cover the processes to demonstrate compliance with new and existing technical regulations as well as standards. So they're used by both governments as well as by private businesses, our conformity assessment standards, and internationally recognized tests, inspections, and certificates backed up by a system of accreditation enable businesses to reduce the cost of meeting the requirements of technical regulations or standards, and of course increase their trade opportunities. Finally, in the short term, we believe that three actions are really critical The first one, of course, is that it's necessary to keep medical and other essential goods moving across our borders. And as mentioned by some of the other speakers, special trade facilitation measures are necessary, such as, for example, green lanes for essential goods and re-looking our approach, of course, towards risk management. A second critical measure, of course, is that we need to look at speedier and simplified conformity assessment, and it's really good to see some of the notifications received by the WTO are from members where they're actually on a temporary basis looking at postponing some of these conformity assessment procedures, or they're actually introducing simplified conformity assessment during these times. The third short-term measure that's really critical, of course, is that governments in particular ensure that their domestic regulations on medical and other essential goods are aligned with the relevant international standards. Finally, from a more longer-term perspective, we all agree that the global trade outlook is both challenging and uncertain, and it's essential that developing countries, including countries in East Africa, start looking at investments in quality infrastructure, including standards and conformity assessment services. I think from a safe trade perspective, without a well-functioning quality infrastructure, in other words, access to international standards, as well as access to conformity assessment services, it will increasingly become difficult for our businesses to participate in safe trade. This means that we'll have to look at adopting a more strategic approach towards quality. We need to develop or review as appropriate our quality policies as well as our action plans. For this, we need close cooperation between governments, standards and conformity assessment bodies, and of course, business. This is critical as our resources are increasingly stretched, they're limited, and we need to invest in quality activities that will give us real returns and benefit our economies and societies as a whole. Just to wrap up, as ISO, we of course support our developing country members to develop their national standardization strategies and supporting with particular relevant strategic standards of benefit to their societies. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Eric, and really appreciate it. And some good points made there about the importance of really investment in quality infrastructure. Okay, and lots on trade facilitation too. We're getting a lot of questions in. I want to give it enough time, so I want to just come to our last panelist, to Mr. Apollo Awar, who's the chair of the Fresh Produce Exporters Association of Kenya, EPIC. So Apollo, great to have you on the line this afternoon. Can you tell us how has COVID-19 impacted on fresh produce supply chains in the region, and particularly in Kenya? We've heard a little bit already from Jackie about that, but could you tell us a little bit more of the experience in Kenya, and what adjustments and upgrading initiatives are being undertaken by the private sector to cope with basically the problem of the virus, but also government requirements and market standards to ensure sort of safe trade? Over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and good afternoon, everybody. Wow, everything within this industry revolves around logistics. Fresh produce are highly perishable, and the market's destination, especially with regard to what we're looking at in respect to COVID, has been on logistics, and the shortfall has been huge. I think since the stoppage of passenger flights and a few other cargo vessels flying into the region, there has been a drastic fall on volumes shipped out of the country, especially for those markets that are overseas, the UK and the EU. This has led to a big fallout. We're looking at close to falling from 5,000 metric tons per week to close to just slightly above 1,200 metric tons. So you can imagine just on that impact, with the orders definitely being high, and space availability is very limiting. So this is literally one of the major impacts that we have seen with respect to COVID-19. And also, of course, also there's issues to do with movements of people movement due to logistics, especially when we are trying to understand the cross-border and within the borders. Part of it has been issues of just trying to manage whether they are truck drivers or personnel who are in charge or who are directly involved in the preparation or in the harvest of products. This has been quite some impact. So impact on trade for this has been very pronounced, and we also see across the value chain some of the businesses right now definitely might not operate beyond the end of this month due to the disruption on trade, particularly since there is a lack of cargo space. And the direct implication is either there's going to be a lot of farmers, especially the smallholder farmers, as well as the large farming operations that are likely to minimize the operations or to literally close down. We're looking at huge percentage of human resource aspect being affected within the industry, especially when we're looking at the numbers of people that are employed in this regard. There is issues as well to do with financial management through the shortfalls on cash flow from businesses as a result of lack of access to the market. So companies have been forced now to scale down and are hurting financially at this point in time. We are also going to see a serious disruption in terms of technical services that have been being provided to farmers through extension services and disruption of planting, especially for the very quick growing crops like beans and peas and the legumes that are grown. Potential loss of talent and especially also the traditional outgrower bases. So this depressed economic situation is definitely threatening a lot of enterprises in this industry. We have lately seen even across the border, trading within the region has been hampered through movement of trucks across the borders, and that definitely has given a new dimension towards what we're looking at, a new pricing structure from where domestic demand is very high for commodities that would come out from other partners implications. And now when you're looking at some of the initiatives that the private sector is playing is a lot of lobbying with the governments to safeguard and to secure a bit of space through negotiating with the airlines and any available vessels that would fly in. One of the critical things that has been looked at is we have plenty of volume that can be moved northwards, but we have lack of cargo that would be shipped southbound. So the need now to which drives a lot of cost for freight cost very high when vessels fly out with empty coming to the south empty. So I think part of the challenge is we have to really look into the aspect of how within the region how we can be able to consolidate sufficient cargo to fly into this region in order to attract cargo into the region. We are also looking at the aspect of food safety as well, and how this can be used on promotion. And I think Jackie mentioned it. As we look at within the supply chain, there are various critical areas where you could be the points of contamination or the points of carrier points. And I think on the basis of some of the private voluntary standards that are being used by the industry, there are certain clauses that point to food defense plans that will be able to then look into the entire supply chain on areas that could be of importance, especially in trying to eliminate or to minimize risks of contamination.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. Could you wind up if that's all right?
Yeah, so I think in general sense, this is pretty much where we are at, and I would be able to share more when if there is any questions that would come up. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thanks, Apollo. Really appreciate. And yeah, gosh, we've got a lot of questions and probably too many for the time that we've got. But let me first of all handle the chat, because my phone is buzzing with questions. But I think Gerald asked, Jackie, maybe a question to you, and potentially I think also Apollo. But as this goes on, is there going to be a longer term problem with planting in the horticultural industry? I think that was Gerald's question. And then, you know, do some of the control measures for COVID-19 pose food security risks? That was a question. And then I think Carol on the chat here has asked a question. What would be your advice, Jackie, and I guess Apollo and probably Martha, but let's first get the answer from Jackie. What would be your advice on mitigating layoffs in the industry, in the horticultural industry, and what measures should be put in place to protect workers? So Jackie, can I just give you 2 minutes to answer those, and then after that I'll pass it over to Apollo. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank. To start with, on the mitigation measures on packhouse workers, I would say one would be providing them with safety gears. I think that is very, very critical. But also having testing devices right at the farm, so that all workers who are coming to the farm, whether they are going to the packhouse or they are actually coming to the premises, are tested before the gate. But also implementing the social distancing in the packhouse, and where possible, enlarging the packhouse size by extending, you know, the packhouse to the available space within the company, so that, you know, the tables are not so close to each other, and, you know, workers in the table, so you're minimizing the number of packers around the table. So I think those are some of the measures that needs to be taken. But most important is also to reduce the number of workers and also let them come in cycles. So you don't have all of them at the same time in the packhouse, but you let them come in cycles. On the question about export incentives, as mentioned by my counterpart in Kenya, that logistics is actually revolving around, you know, all these challenges to do with horticulture export. So I would say number one is for government to actually improve on enabling environment for cargo and cargo operations, whether it's at the ports or airports. One, checking out like to have the right landing fees, the parking fees, and so government should really review such kind of charges, making it possible for some of these airlines to actually come to the countries, and also the vessels. But two, the issue of tax relief. Seriously, our government should actually seriously consider offering stimulus packages to our sectors that are badly hit, like horticulture and also other agriculture sector. Negotiation with the central banks to relax loan terms, including interest rate or special waiver to commercial banks to relax loan terms, including interest rate for ongoing loans that were extended to some of these companies. So those are some of the measures. And the last one I would say consider is for the private sector to negotiate with the government to consider issuing a special waiver to companies on payment of labor-related statutory taxes in order to prevent companies from laying off staff. So those are some of the incentives that could be considered.
Okay. That's great. Thanks for that. Apollo, do you want to comment on any of that? And a question I've had in here as well is that this one of the audience thought that air freight was subject to the same open access as trucks. So do you want to comment on that question as well?
Well, I think part of the air freight is it's not similar to the trucks. It's a very different scenario, because with air freight you're basically relying on northbound and the north-south trading capacity, and that is the critical thing. And most of the cargo would be shipped through passenger liners, especially on the belly of the aircraft. So with the withdrawal of all these passenger aircraft, then that meant a big percentage of freight capacity has been removed from the business. Now, when it comes to the aspect of disruptions and the plantings and mitigations of layoffs, and at that regard, I think much more of it will revolve around rethinking of business strategies, especially looking at a regional aspect. Business having been largely concentrating on exports and overseas, there is now a bigger impetus now to look at working on very key instruments on promoting regional and domestic businesses and formalizing this sort of business. I think COVID-19 provides an opportunity then to introduce a way in which we can probably formalize domestic and regional businesses through a well-established quality infrastructure, as has been mentioned from one of our previous panelists.
Okay, thanks, Apollo. Hermogene, I've got one here for you. Do we have systems within ARSO to help with the harmonization of conformity assessments? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, Frank. We have what we call Conformity Assessment Committee. Actually, this committee is working very well, where we have now currently the sustainability certification, which is called TradeMark Africa, where there is implementation of African standard on sustainability in fisheries, agriculture, aquaculture, not only limited to that, tourism and the forestry, that is also included. When you look at that, we have an African mark. Actually, this was from the demand from the ministers in charge of environment, African ministers in charge of environment, in a way to improve the African competitivity. Because if we take into consideration sustainability issues, and we have a certification system where we have trained SMEs, we have trained the certification bodies to undertake this conformity assessment on all at the whole continental level. Meaning our committee is there, and we are moving forward to another African mark. That's actually linked to the whole topic of how can we trust the product from Africa. The EcoMark is registered in the WIPO, is registered internationally, and for another African mark will link also to other product. And to make clarification, we look at mostly on unique product for Africa. Wherever there is other international conformity assessment program, we do the benchmarking. We are now benchmarking with a fair trade, and we are under discussion with other conformity assessment schemes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. I thought keep your questions coming in. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. Okay, here we go. Sorry, apologies. I'm just trying to. Okay, so yeah, just a question, Hermogene. One kind of other follow-up question for you is: how do the standards in the EAC, how do they relate also to some of the ARSO standards? I think you partially answered that, but do you want to just have a quick comment on?
Yes. A very quick comment. We have had a series of meetings between ARZO and regional economical communities. And the recent meeting, actually last year, has put on a standard management committee. The standard management committee will include one member from the regional economical community and 6 members from other ARZO members. This is a way of avoiding duplication. As much as on the continent we avoid duplication, it's the only way we can be serving our traders, our industry. They shouldn't be confused on proliferation of different standards. We are talking currently on public standards, but there are also private standards, as we all know. Yeah, we should, as much as possible, avoid duplication. Lastly, we have also put on another committee, which is called JAG, the Joint Advisory Group. That also is composed by REX and the member of ARZO Council to discuss on strategic issues in the standard area. Meaning with what we have called the African standard harmonization model, we are able to develop a standard looking at what is already existing at the regional economical community. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hermogene. Really appreciate. I've got some questions here as well. In terms of ISO, and that would go to you, Eric. You know, there's a question here about repurposing garments factories to produce medical equipment in the region. What key ISO standards or medical standards do you think would be applicable to companies repurposing to produce masks and personal protective equipment to fight COVID? Eric, do you want to take that one?
Frank, as I mentioned, we've made a number of standards freely available online on the ISO website. So my advice would be log into iso.org. On our landing page, there's a COVID-19 section. And if you click there, you'll find a list of all the standards, the ISO standards relating to personal protective equipment, as well as the medical devices. So they're all available online. They're highlighted. They are currently, as I mentioned, available for free online in a read-only format. So it's all listed there. A last thing that I can just very quickly mention to you as well is on the COVID-19 part of our website, we also have listed from our members, the national standards bodies, standards around these equipment. Like you mentioned, you know, some companies are interested in repurposing, you know, what they currently have. So we also have made available not only the international ISO standards governing these goods, but also access to our member websites. And just very briefly, one of our members, the French standards body, AFNOR, literally within a period of about 7 days, developed a new standard on barrier masks that's actually available online for free. So through the ISO website, you've got access to our standards that are available, as well as those of our members relating to these goods.
Okay, thanks, Eric. That's great. I've got a question here for Melvin. Melvin, I've got a question here from someone in Rwanda, somebody I know quite well. Why is it that this whole area of quality standards and different frameworks, why is there so much underinvestments in standards when they're so important for human health and also for trade? So Melvin, over to you for that one.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, for that question. I think we have been seeing this, I guess, for a long time, that there is underinvestment, and often it is, at least if I speak for the SPS area, for instance, that it's often perceived as a very technical area. So it's often very hard to make the case, you know, with superiors. be it higher level decision makers or politicians or ministries of finance, to invest more in this area. But it is a very important point, and it also touches upon some things that Martha said earlier in her intervention, essentially pointing to the fact that I guess we need to be better prepared, and we need to make more investments long term also in our health and in our SPS systems. And that also means in our veterinary services and in our plant health agencies. And this really requires long-term investments with sort of knock-on effects on trade over time. And it's often very much about showing also what is the economic burden of not investing in some of these areas. The WHO and the World Bank have issued reports that show the burden of foodborne disease. There is currently also some research and work going on in looking at the burden of animal diseases and plant pests. Because it is true, if you think about it, and I thought about that a lot actually over the last weeks. I mean, everybody is now talking about COVID-19, but what's going to be the big next issue out there? Is it going to be antimicrobial resistance, AMR? You have a big locust plague at the moment in East Africa, which is often called a crisis within a crisis. So, much more need to be done to convince higher level decision makers of the need to invest in this area. It's a very good point. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Melvin. That's great. Maybe I'm gonna. There's a question there on Martha. You mentioned about cross-border trade, and really, there's a question here about what's the role of EAC bodies to try to help safe trade occur at borders. I certainly could comment on that one, but let me give you the floor, Martha. Over to you.
Thanks, Frank. I think you should. You've done a lot of work on trade facilitation, but I think EAC partner states have made a lot of commitments in terms of how they can facilitate trade and the transit of goods with minimum disruption, and while also reducing overall transaction costs. But I think that there is still a lot of scope to improve in the way we do business, especially at the borders. I think there is a lot of the people who work, for example, in the plant health, animal health, and food safety domain. They are so used to protection and they don't think with their trade facilitation lens. I think that if we integrated more our risk-based lens and looking at various options and taking options that are at a lower cost, it would go a long way to facilitate trade, while also looking at the informal cross-border trade people, try as much as possible facilitate them and mainstream them into formal trade. It would go a long way to improve trade across borders. A lot of other commitments have been done by partner states, and I think TradeMark has done a lot of work to improve border infrastructure. We just need to integrate simplified low-cost SPS verification systems within the overall trade facilitation arrangement.
Thanks, Martha. And it's good. I mean, just to, I guess, mention, I've tried to prioritize questions rather than to talk about what TradeMark's doing. But Martha, you gave me the entry point, so let me just quickly mention it. I mean, we are planning to do a lot of work basically to help trade continue during the crisis. We're seeing a lot of problems with truck drivers being stuck at borders, equally people worried about truck drivers being vectors for the virus. So one of the things we want to try to do is make sure that there's proper tracking of truck drivers, like a medical passport approach, so that goods can move quicker at the borders. Also, we're going to be working with PPE and thinking hard about monitoring value chains. But specifically related to standards, I think this point that a couple of people have raised about making sure that the local, our regional production, and it's great to see regional producers stepping up, producing medical equipment, also masks. It's great to see that, but we need to make sure that those meet minimum safety requirements, and that's really going to be important at this time. And also thinking about how some of the standards basically, can, in terms of food standards, this can really, our exports can adhere to what's required. We'll continue the good work at basically strengthening national quality infrastructure and thinking about how testing kits can come out of the region down the line. Anyway, those are some of the things. I mean, we'll say more about that, but I just wanted to give our panelists now, because I think we're coming into the final straight. Apologies if I couldn't get all your questions. There were just too many, and I think we will continue the conversation on Twitter. But let me maybe just pass it over to the panelists. Panelists, I'd like you to please just give us literally 1 minute of your closing statements and a summary of what you think is important that's come out of today's discussion. So, Melvin, I'm going to pass it over to your good self first. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. Well, I think there were lots of extremely good points made, and following the discussion and at the same time keeping an eye on the chat and seeing sort of all the questions that pop up was really showed that. So congratulations for an excellent meeting. I think points made about trade facilitation, I think, are very important. Points also about making sure that any measures that countries are putting in place, that they're targeted, proportionate, and temporary. I think that's important. Technology came up, so the use of e-commerce, blockchain, traceability, electronic certification, I think is also important. Somebody also, spoke about food security. We didn't really go into that, but increasingly also, the food sector is affected by social distancing measures. So increasingly, you can see that, there are concerns popping up there as well. So it's definitely something to be monitored. But those were sort of the main, let's say, issues that I would take away from the session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Melvin, and great having you here today. Thanks so much for that. Jackie, pass it over to you. Any reflections? Just in a minute, please. Over to you, Jackie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank. I think there's been a lot of very good points from all the speakers, but key is that trade facilitation at this moment is very, very critical, with greater emphasis on smooth cross-border trade, ensuring that cargo movement is going on by creating enabling environment. But also at this time, I think it is very, very critical that there is very strong public-private partnership that goes beyond the country level to address the challenges, but also realize the opportunities that are brought about by the pandemic. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Great to have you on board as well. Thank you for that. Hermogene, do you want to make any final comments? Over to you.
Yes, my final comment would be, I saw in the discussion that we have so many tools, we have different programs that can help our industries. The main issue is how do we implement what exists, mainly on standard issue, on conformity assessment, and a plan for being ready in the future. Because the result exists, but we should have even influenced the work previously. Now, how do we play out in the future in the position, the region, position Africa, if anything happened, but even in a positive way. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hermogene. Good to hear the continental and AU view there. Martha, could I call on your good self? Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, final thought. Very important. I think we must improve in the way we monitor hazards on food supply chains and the way we deal with them in a proactive manner across businesses and inspection systems. Work to strengthen and invest in systems that deal with transboundary diseases. Also connecting systems, services, and people who provide services in the businesses and inspection systems across countries so that we improve trust and we trade without disrupting trade. Those are my takeaways.
Okay, thanks, Martha. Very eloquent and great to have you on the line today. Really appreciate. Eric, any thoughts from your good self?
Thank you, Frank, and let me actually start by thanking you for the invitation. It was really a good opportunity to participate in this conference. Just one thought that I actually wanted to leave you with. I'm not going to repeat, the many good points that have already been made, but this is the question that you actually asked towards Melvin, which I think lies at the heart of many of the challenges that developing countries are experiencing at the moment in keeping goods moving during the pandemic, and that is creating much greater awareness on the part of our policymakers and businesses about the need to work together to create much greater awareness around the need to strengthen and invest in our quality infrastructure, and specifically participation in international standardization activities for priority goods for developing country economies. And then, as I mentioned, conformity assessment services. If we do not invest in our ability to work with our businesses so that there are conformity assessment services available, it's going to become increasingly difficult to be able to export goods, because there is going to be a greater emphasis, I think, in the future on the safety and the quality aspects of goods. And if we don't have that infrastructure to support it, we are going to find difficulties to export from developing countries. So I think that awareness and thinking about how can we raise this, and then doing the hard technical work to actually make that investments really important.
Okay, thanks, Eric. That's great, and I think an important call to arms. All right, and Apollo, sir, would you like to make any final remarks?
I think for me, it would be very critical to look at investments within the regional aspect to ensure that we are able to have proper movement of goods and services and people. And
yeah, Apollo, I'm losing you. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that we may need to look at strengthening the regional trading bloc within the EAC and invest heavily on the quality infrastructure, so that we are able to position the region as a strong source and also enhance cross-border trading, and also position the region as a very strong source for produce internationally.
Thanks, Apollo. Fantastic. I thought that's actually really good points. And let me just thank our panel once again. I thought they were superb. Some really great points made there. So I'm going to give you a round of applause. There you go. We tend to do that at TradeMark, but what I take away from this is what Melvin said, is that any constraints on trade need to be targeted, they need to be temporary, they need to be proportionate. I thought those three words were good. And this point about traceability at times like this, incredibly important, and quite a call to arms from many of the panel to invest in quality infrastructure to support export growth. I'm also hearing from the industry itself, from a number of agricultural industry players, that it's critical to make sure that cargo movement continues. And we've seen huge escalation in cargo rates. It's good to hear, Jackie, how you brought in basically transport into Tanzania, but it's a constraint that our exporters really face. Trade facilitation is really important in that. Hermogene, I think, really brought across the AU perspective of let's think about the wider market and get the tools in place to help us implement harmonization. Martha, I thought you made some good points about monitoring hazards and thinking about cross-border issues, which certainly keep me awake at night here at TradeMark. And yeah, I thought that was a very interesting discussion. So many thanks to the panel. I know that my team at TradeMark are on hand to continue the dialogue on Twitter. If you've got questions that you don't feel were answered fully in this session, please continue to use the Twitter handle. But with that, I'd like to close the session. Just to thank all of our panel again. I'm sorry that we weren't able to connect up the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Cooperatives in Uganda, but we'll save that fun for next time. Many thanks, and I guess my parting message is standards really matter to trade, and we really need to keep safe trade going, and it's an important issue. And with that, thank you very much, one and all. Really appreciate, and I would say to you, please stay safe, stay well, look after yourself and your loved ones. Okay, many thanks indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.